I actually think it comes back to identity and what shapes our identities. For me, legacy, heritage, and upbringing shape who I am. And I lean in very hard to my self-identity, but being Jewish is so core to my identity. It has been for my entire life, and not just being Jewish, but being Jewish and being a 3G survivor.
If you heard what I heard, this podcast shares the powerful stories of Holocaust survivors, told by their grandchildren, the last generation to ever hear Holocaust survivor stories firsthand. So join me as we listen, learn, and remember. Together, we can make sure the world will never forget so that it never happens again. Welcome to the If You Heard What I Heard podcast. My name is Carolyn Siegel, and I'm the founder and executive director of If You Heard What I Heard. Today, I'm honored to be here with If You Heard What I Heard interviewee and advisor, Leya Kaufman. Leya is an executive in brand partnerships and publishing in New York City. She's a mom of two, married to another 3G, a grandson of Holocaust survivors, and an advocate for Holocaust education and Jewish causes. She shares the story of her grandfather, Alex Gross, for If You Heard What I Heard. We are very grateful that Alex is approaching 100 years of age, and while it's getting harder for him to share his story, he and we are very proud of Leya for all she does to keep his story alive. I'm so excited to be here with you today, Leya. Thank you for taking the time to do this.
Hi, Carolyn. It's great to be here. It's an honor.
Yeah, so you've really been on this journey with us from very early days, and you've been an advisor for us pretty much from the second we did your interview. I think the organization really resonated with you from the beginning. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about why it was so important for you to share your grandfather's story, because I know that you've done speaking engagements prior to getting involved with our organization, but why was it important for you, firstly, to share your story with If You Heard What I Heard, and what drew you to our organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was about 10 when I fully grasped the real context of the Holocaust, what it meant. It wasn't just glossed over in day school, but I fully felt the gravity of it. And I had heard about it my entire life, my grandfather being a survivor and his narrative being part of everyday living. But it wasn't really until I was approaching my bat mitzvah that I fully understood the weight of it. However, as an optimistic 10-year-old, the concept of never again felt final. And I always looked at the Holocaust as if it were pure and simple history. My grandfather was writing a book for as long as I can remember. And that book, to me, it was a historical document. It was a narrative. It had captured what had happened in the past. It would never happen again. It was a lifetime and a hardship that others had suffered so that our generation wouldn't have to. And that was the reality that I lived in close to my 20s. I mean, it wasn't until over a decade later that I did more research. I started to grow up and I came really front to front and face to face with antisemitism. And I also learned that not everyone learned about the Holocaust. Not everybody had a grandfather who told a story or went to a school where a grandfather was invited to come and tell their story. I lived in a bubble until college. And it wasn't until I went away that I really knew and grasped the fact that it wasn't just history, it was a reality. And it was something that had happened to my grandfather, yes, but a lesson and a narrative that couldn't just live in the confines of a book. So when we connected and I heard about your mission, and If You Heard What I Heard, and the concept of oral history being so paramount to making sure that these stories don't die within the confines of a history book or don't live only in the few Holocaust narratives that only a subset of small schools read, I wanted to be a part of it. I wanted to learn the intricacies of his story, the details, the chronological timeline, and I wanted to feel comfortable enough sharing that story with others as if it were my own, so that one day, as my child, my children rather, approach 10, I can go in and I can be the grandfather to them. I can tell that story that really woke me up, and it lives as a cautionary tale.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love it. It's actually the opening to the trailer for your trailer and also for the round of interviews that launched with yours. Let me tell you a story about a little boy.
Mhm.
And I think that that's really what it comes down to. I think you, in your interview, have such a way of relating the story to make it personal for today.
Yep. No, I mean, certainly. I love watching my oldest, Ezra. He's very outgoing, and my mom and I always joke that he's very much like my grandfather. If we take Ezra to shul, he'll walk around and start introducing himself. He'll say, I want to take a lap and see who's here. It's just like my grandfather in that way. Really has his social wits about him. And he will approach strangers on a playground, play soccer. My grandfather was the same way. And I think back to a part of his story where he said, they always used to just play soccer with the neighborhood kids. Didn't matter what your religion was, didn't matter if you were Jewish or not, until it did. And one day, absolutely everything changed. And the question became, are you Jewish? And, they couldn't play soccer with them anymore. Those children were becoming Hitler Youths. And I see the dangers and the scary threats, the social media comments. And I've started to hide my children from my own personal social media channels. And it's real. It feels like never again really is now. And organizations like If You Heard What I Heard are more important now than ever.
Well, thank you for saying that. It's really scary what we're seeing, but I think a lot of us have been saying for a while, like recognizing the warning signs and really like standing up and sort of shouting from the rooftops, like, hey, pay attention to what's going on around you. This anti-Semitism that we're seeing today is really dangerous and we need to wake up to it.
Yep,
But I'm
absolutely.
curious, as someone who grew up being very close to your grandfather and hearing his story, I can absolutely relate to, as we get older, I don't want to say that we take the story more seriously, but we can relate to more pieces of it as we gain more of our own life experiences. And so, was there anything that this process of preparing for your interview, did you learn anything new or gain any other insight that you didn't have previously?
Yeah, I think I started to think about the backstory more, right? The fact that his father was a tailor and he had a very humble upbringing. I started to think about their financial situation, and I no longer thought of his story as starting with that first ride to the ghetto and ending with liberation. But I started thinking about the broader context of his life. You had prepared me with a few questions to, better understand in advance. And I started talking to a lot of people. And I think what's really unique about the Holocaust, and we're seeing it now with the rise in anti Semitism in the midst of this war, but the Holocaust didn't care who you were. It didn't care whether you were wealthy or poor. It didn't care whether you were religious and observant or whether you were more secular. And my grandfather's story is just one of them. But there were those details that I started to really grasp, the fact that he had dirt floors, and now this rise in anti Semitism, this preconceived notion that Jews are in a position of power and that we should be hated because we have, when, there's this narrative that's now spiraled out of control. I think back to that and I think of the fact that my grandfather oftentimes didn't have enough food to eat and was getting sick off of roots that he found in the garden because there wasn't enough food to go around the table. And nobody knows that story, or people aren't well aware of it. And it's not a part of the story that I really paid a lot of attention to until I was preparing for my interview and until I had to speak about his life and who he was throughout the entirety of it.
Yeah, that's a really big piece of our work is showing that these were people like you and me that had their lives upended for no other reason than they were Jewish. That's like paramount because I want whoever's watching your interview to connect with your grandfather and feel like they know him and they know his family. And I think today, as it relates to anti-Semitism, it comes back to it's kind of like the whole narrative with social media, right? Like you only see a piece and you assume that that's how someone's entire life is, but you don't know the backstory. You don't know what they're dealing with in their personal life. You don't know what's going on, how much or how little someone has just because they put something forward. Or that, as Jews, to your point, we've been seeing it for thousands of years that there are assumptions that are made about us as Jews just because we're Jewish.
Or how hard they've worked. I mean, I see certain comments and I'm shocked at the misinformation. The assumption that like my grandfather came here, got a huge check, and started a life is just so entirely and completely false. She was desolate for a very long time and worked really, really, really hard through a number of struggles to try to build and then rebuild a life for him and his family, eventually finding success. And those are not parts of the Holocaust story that you even read in a Holocaust narrative quite often. I think one of the most important parts of your interview is when you talk about after the war and what starting a life might look like for someone that maybe they don't speak English yet. Maybe in his case, he was young enough to still go to an orphanage after he was liberated. And that's not the reality you read about quite often. His his parents were murdered. He was in an orphanage immediately following the war. He couldn't find a path to the US right away. It was a struggle. But yeah, all really important life lessons and context to have when educating about the Holocaust. And I think If You Heard What I Heard does such a great job of making sure that that's part of the lesson.
Well, thank you for saying that. It's really, that's the other piece is that we're one of the only Holocaust nonprofits out there that focuses on the resilience. You don't get that part of the story oftentimes when you go to a museum or you read something online or look for sure when you look at a textbook, you don't hear about that. How hard they worked when they came here and with no help, right? There wasn't anyone. I mean, there were agencies that like
There were Jewish founded small scale agencies. And I mean, I was just at an event where there was that discussion about, what it looked like. And my husband and I always talk about how all of these smaller agencies, I mean, they all do good, but there's a fragmented approach to charitable efforts amongst the Jewish community because many Jews want to support causes up and away and abroad, and they're focused on, maintaining Jewish life and, feeding Jewish children in impoverished areas, internationally. And then there are other organizations that are solely focused on domestic causes. And if you were coming here, it also depended, was it right after the war? Was it years later? And how did you get to the US? And forget the US for a minute. I mean, there were a number of people that fought in Israel's independence because it was the only place that they could lay a foundation and start a home. My Uncle Sam was one of them. I mean, there are so many of these stories. He was too old to go to an orphanage. He only had the option of enlisting in the army. I mean, you just don't hear about those parts of survival.
right, exactly. And we have a number of interviewees who actually share that how their grandparents made it to Israel and then were fighting for Israel's independence. So going from one war, surviving through one war and a genocide to then fighting in another.
Yep.
And it is a really important part of the narrative to share because it's part of their whole story. And I think it's part of what made them extraordinary.
Yep. Yep. And now hearing, or seeing comments, go home to Poland, should have gone home to Poland. I mean, what home? My grandfather's town didn't exist anymore. It's, you go there now, it's not a little shtetl. It doesn't, it's not, there was no place to go home. There were no parents. There was no livelihood. There was no, functioning synagogue anymore. The kosher meat distribution had been cut off by the Nazis. I mean, everyone was homeless and finding and setting forth a new path for themselves following liberation. And it's definitely a part of Holocaust education that the broader world likes to conveniently forget.
Totally. Yeah, and also it's not like they were met with open arms when they tried to go back home, right? And a lot of going back home was like, do I have a home to go back to? What's left here? Am I going to find family? Is there going to be an opportunity for me to rebuild? There's that saying, you can't go home again. And I really think for many of our Holocaust survivor grandparents, that was the case.
Yep, absolutely.
Leya, we're so grateful that, as I mentioned in the intro, that your grandfather Alex is with us and you're able to hug him and be with him. And we filmed your interview at this point a few years ago. And so I'm curious to know what his reaction was to you sharing his story.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely, as he approaches 100, cognitively declining, as many of our survivors do. He was, for my entire life, the most outspoken and the most educational leader in Holocaust lesson, generational awareness. In my family of survivors, he led the charge there, and all of the other cousins looked up to my Zadie as being the speaker in the family, the one to tell our story. And as I started to speak, and he did hear about my interview, and I shared it with him, and I mean, he just says, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I think what I get out of my time with him is the reality that he wouldn't be able to give an interview today. You wouldn't be able to put him in front of a camera and ask him to recount his story anymore. But he's done all that work. Now it's up to everybody else. And I am so lucky that I can go and I can hold his hand. But one day I won't be able to go and hold his hand. And whether I can hold his hand now, I still have to be able to speak for him and to share his story. And to get to practice that now while he is still alive is that much more meaningful, because I'm not just learning to do that as a default in the future, but giving him at least the promise while he's here that his stories will go on and that we won't be doomed to forget the legacy that he left.
Honestly, it's an amazing gift that he is able to react and that he is able to see
Yep.
that it's carrying forward, because that's really, for us as an organization and for me personally, in my starting, if you heard what I heard, there's such a big piece of that foundationally is centered on, making good on the promise to Holocaust survivors everywhere that the world will not forget. That's our mission, to make sure the world will not forget. I get
Yep.
asked from time to time, like, what is the goal of your organization? Make sure the world doesn't forget.
Yep.
And if you ever ask a Holocaust survivor, you would never ask a Holocaust survivor, what is the goal of sharing your story?
Right.
It just is. And so for me, it's as natural as that. It just is. We have to keep sharing these stories.
Yep. No, and I also think people said, oh, he was writing a book. Was he a writer? No, wasn't a writer. When he was speaking, was he a trained speaker? I mean, I think if you asked him, he would say, write whether you can write, speak whether or not you feel comfortable speaking, because that was what he proved he was capable of doing, because there was no other choice. Because if he didn't share that, if he didn't know, no one in my family would know our story, and we wouldn't know about those that we lost and what it was like growing up in Plonka. I mean, we wouldn't have any of this history, this oral history that's been passed to us. And I think what you're doing is you're creating that for the next generation, and for the generation that, like, for better or for worse, is so tied to our devices that we use them as a shield. And we don't think we need to educate ourselves past, a 60-second clip quite often. And you're really breaking down those boundaries and forcing, especially the 3Gs, to lean in, lean back, do their research, come prepared, and have the type of interview that many of our grandparents had with the Shoah Foundation. years ago. And proving that we can do that and that we will make our children capable of doing that into the future is part of Never Again. It's the promise, to your point, that we made to the survivors that we will continue to carry on.
Yeah, and not only that, but I really think that for us in sharing these stories, there's not like a training that we ask our interviewees to go through. It really is just like you show up and come with your story. Like I'll give you the tools, the research tools so that you can piece it together in a way that makes sense for you, but it is your story to share. I know that there are some wonderful organizations out there that do focus a lot on like training of this is how to tell the story. I'm not it's not my job to tell you how to tell your story.
Yep.
It's my job to give you a space to tell your story
Yep.
and hopefully a opportunity for others to come and listen to that story.
Yeah. And for you to go back and have your own manifesto to listen to, right? And to refresh before I tell my children their grandfather's story, I will be re-referencing my interview. And will I make them watch my interview? I hopefully will have the chutzpah to speak it to their faces. But, yes, we recorded years ago, and years from now, when they're old enough to know the good, the bad, and the ugly, every detail, I am so glad that I have that recording and that I did that research with you. I see it as a tool. And yes, I hope people sit and they listen to the entirety, but whether or not they do, recording it to me is one of the biggest values that the organization provides. You're really doing a service to survivors, but also to 3G and then to their offspring by giving them the foundational knowledge of their stories.
Well, it's really nice to hear that, and I appreciate how much this process and being part of our work has meant to you and your family for sure. I know what's interesting actually because you mentioned that your Zadie is such a light and a beacon within your own family, and I just want to shout out to your cousin Ben who also shared his grandfather's story, Bill, who is Alex's brother. He shared his story for If You Heard What I Heard, and he even talks about that, how his own grandfather passed away at an early age, and a lot of what he learned and knew came from your grandfather.
Yeah, absolutely. And his grandfather's story also, while it has so many parallels, is so unique. And his mom is actually now the historian in our family. We always say my cousin Erica, Ben's mom, she has more pictures than anybody else. She's cataloging everything. She's writing so much down. I love going to their house in Westchester and just it's like walking into a piece of history. She has more captured and organized than anyone else. And now she's carrying that torch for that generation. And hopefully Ben and I will carry it for ours.
It's amazing. I'm grateful to have you both be a part of our organization and sharing your stories. And Ben did a really great job with his interview. So can't wait for everyone to listen to his as well.
Can't wait. Proud of him.
How has sharing your interview with us changed your perspective, particularly in the wake of October 7th?
Oh, I mean, I feel like I wake up to a different reality every day. Just when I think I figured it out, I think I'm thrown off again by something I see in the news, not just in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, but months and now over a year later. I mean, I think that I am challenged to even come to terms with the assumptions I told you I made when I was 10, but will never happen again. I've never felt so close to the reality that our ancestors really lived. I think of the rise in antisemitism and the biggest shift in perspective, maybe that I've experienced, is what the root of it all was. Growing up, you just assumed, oh, well, there was this historic hate that will never exist again. And it was rooted in this, improper assumption that Jews were bad or Jews were dirty. And now the oppressed and oppressor narrative that has resurfaced has challenged my perception on what the root of anti-Semitism is. And it's made it clear that anti-Semitism will always exist. And it will be our duty to fight it, hopefully through nonviolent means. I mean, I'm certainly a pacifist, as many of us are, but one of the strongest weapons we have as 3Gs are our voices and sharing the stories and, you know, re educating and hopefully recalibrating perspectives so that they are more understanding of the intricacies of how individuals grow up. And we were talking about it earlier, but no, you weren't just born into money, born into power. No, you didn't just have a pre existing reason for such hate. And actually, the narrative that as a people you did is what took people with dirt floors and humble gardens away from their home in mass numbers and ruthlessly murdered them all. Those aren't those are the things that I constantly think about post interview and then post October 7th is my perception of why the Holocaust happened has certainly changed. And having the background of doing the interview with you, relearning the story so recently, and then living the reality that we're living now as Jews, it's been a massive wake up call.
Yeah, I think for a lot of us, been really shocking to see the similarities in the lead up to the Holocaust. And yours was actually, I put a reel together, it's on our social media, showing anti Semitic incidents, mostly in Los Angeles, because I partnered with an activist here who had posted a lot of the anti Semitic incidents that were happening. And these were anti Semitic incidents that were fairly recent, post October 7th, that had happened. And I put voiceover from our interviews onto this reel, and yours was one of them. Yours was one of the things that, one of the voiceovers that I included that talked about the lead up to the Holocaust. And it was so eerie to see the similarities.
Mhm.
It's just kind of crazy. So, Leya, for anyone that follows you and you have large following on social media, for anyone that follows you, like, you are unabashedly Jewish. You take every opportunity to promote Jewish brands, talk about Jewish culture. And how much of that is influenced by what your grandfather went through?
Wow. I mean, I actually think it comes back to identity and what shapes our identities. For me, legacy, heritage, and upbringing shape who I am. And I lean in very hard to my self identity on my channels. But being Jewish is so core to my identity. It has been for my entire life. And not just being Jewish, but being Jewish and being a 3G survivor. It's paramount. I mean, I joke about the fact that when I met my husband, we said hello. We already knew we were Jewish. We had been set up. And within 2 minutes, I said my grandfather was a Holocaust survivor. And he said, so was mine. And that was really the spark that really took us to the next level and secured the second date, for there are a million other reasons too. But no, I mean, it's such a core part of who I am. And especially in times of uncertainty and growing hate or boycotts or an aversion to Jewish or Israeli brands, it feels like it's my only mission that makes sense. I mean, I know that there are people that do this for a living. They go out and they speak and they're advocates and they have more power and influence in so many other channels. For me, finding and sourcing a Jewish owned business or an Israeli brand that I think American women would love that really needs the support because of the economic hardships during wartime and the fact that they might be boycotted by those that know that they're Israeli. I mean, to me, it's a necessity. I don't know if it would be worth even having a channel if I couldn't do that or didn't feel like that was a part of it. And I think it just really comes back to identity. It's how I identify as Jewish. I identify as a 3G survivor. I will always see that as so core to who I am. And so that's what I put out there. I put out who I am.
So you were at the DC March for Israel. What was that like? And also, you were one of the first to say, I'm going to this no matter, like, nothing's stopping me from going. Was
Yep.
part of you being a 3G, did that influence your decision to go?
It drove my entire reason for going. I actually went with my family. So my cousins and I all banded together and went. My husband was worried about security, but I felt really confident in the group that we decided to go with. And it was really special to be there with my 3G cousins. And we felt like it was not only our obligation for our grandparents, but also our obligation for so many of our other cousins that started their lives in Israel. After the war, we talked about how people went everywhere and had to make homes of their own. Our part of the family tree made that home in the United States, but a really big part of that family tree also made a home in Israel. So I knew for a fact that I would have to be there, that I would always stand for Israel's right to exist. I would always stand up for their safety. And having my cousins be there with me, we felt like we were there for our cousins in Israel. So it was very, very special.
Yeah. But where do you see the greater opportunity? Like, as someone who I look at you and your social media and knowing you as my friend and as an advisor for our organization, like, I look at you who as someone who is very, like, well versed on culture, on just like pop culture and what's happening and like what's going on culturally. Um, so where do you see the greater opportunity to make Judaism cool in today's culture, particularly among so much hate? Like, I'm even thinking about how, like, when I was growing up in LA, we even have a cookbook about the Hollywood Bowl. Almost every recipe in that cookbook, it's from the 90s, is a Jewish recipe. Lox and bagels, like latkes. So I think we've lost a little bit of that. I don't think I felt like growing up in LA in the 90s, it was cool to be Jewish. Maybe I was living in a
Now it's
bubble.
like counterculture. No, it's certainly lost a bit of its cool factor or popularity. It's funny, I was at a think tank a while ago, and one of the artists that I was seated with said, Judaism just needs to do a cool collab with something else, the same way that like collabs take off in the fashion space and the beauty space. We need like Judaism to do a collab with Catholicism to make it, more relevant and mainstream again. But I think, again, it comes back to self identity. It comes back to identifying different types of Jews, because I say Judaism is so paramount to who I am, and it is. But I think one thing I love about being Jewish is that it really is an ethnicity and it is a tribal mentality, but there are so many different types of Jews. There are Mizrahi Jews, there are Sephardic Jews. I love discovering different types of Jewish people with really unique heritage, culture, background, recipes of their own. They look very different than me. They dress very different than me. They have different interests, and Judaism might ground us and bring us together. But I think that's where maybe like the long-term opportunity is to making Judaism cool again, is like debunking an assumption on what is a Jew. And maybe we need more Jews who are unique and outspoken and cool to come to the forefront and to be discovered and to be celebrated more broadly.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think for us as Jews, we know that Judaism is cool. We just need other people to know that it's so cool.
Yep.
There's not 1 second or one moment that I think any of us has where we're like, oh, Judaism is cool, because to your point, we are a culture, we are an ethnicity, we are, we have a lot of traditions that ground us and that are really beautiful,
Yeah.
and have been relevant and cool for thousands of years. So with that, I just want to end on a
Yeah.
light, happy note. Is there a tradition that you do today in your family and carry forward today that has survived through the Holocaust?
Well, there's a new tradition that I'll mention, and then maybe one that's more special. I think the new one, and it doesn't date back to the Holocaust, but it's something that I think has been influenced by the Holocaust that will carry through. In the middle of COVID, we started doing group family Zoom Shabbats, and my Zadie will do the Kiddush. And while he's with us, that's something that we'll do and we continue to do every Friday. And yes, some people have conflicts, and there are enough people involved with it that if one person can't dial in, someone else does. And we always have a great group of cousins that join. But even when my Zadie is not here, that's going to be something that always keeps my family together, is not just Shabbos, when you're with someone, but also a virtual moment to check in at the end of the week and to say a prayer, regardless of how far away we might be, to really bring us back together as a family rooted by these survivors that have really laid the foundation for us. I think that's the biggest one. And then in terms of traditions that have survived since the Holocaust, I mean, I think our names, the way that we carry on, my mom's name influenced by my grandfather's mother's name. And with that, I've heard many personality traits weren't lost in the Holocaust. They continue on. And that's what's so special about being Jewish too, is the chicken soup recipe being arguably not so different from what it was, and the person making it also having a personality trait that is very reflected years later and generations thereafter.
Right. Absolutely. Well, Leya, thank you so much for being here with us today and for all you do for our organization. Truly, it's such a joy to work with you at every turn, and I'm so grateful for you. So thank you for being here.
Such an honor. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to If You Heard What I Heard. If you'd like to learn more about our work and support our mission to make sure the world never forgets, please visit our website, ifyouheardwhatiheard.com. We will never let these stories be lost. It is the job of our generation to make sure future generations never forget so that it never happens again.